Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. Today, I have a little update on the HP computer that I featured in my previous How I Personally Refurbish a PC video. In that video, I said that the PC was ready to be sold off for some cash. However, as I was running the Windows updates and even just using the PC relatively normally in audit mode, I heard the power supply screaming like a banshee. What was going on here and what was I going to do to fix it? Stay tuned. Here's a little sample of the noise that the power supply was producing. Now, this noise isn't uncommon in computer parts, especially things like graphics cards and power supplies. This noise is most known as coil whine, which results from the inductors in the power supply that consist of copper wrapped around a ferromagnetic core, vibrating due to the frequencies of the current flowing through them. This, in its own, is nothing but an annoyance, as it doesn't cause any real issues for any of the actual circuits in the computer. In fact, my main PC has quite a bit of coil whine too. However, most of mine comes from my GPU. Here, take a listen. So, if this noise is a non-issue, why am I unhappy about it? Well, I was unhappy about the noise because it was both quite high-pitched and very loud. I could easily hear it from over 8 feet away from the computer, which was unacceptable. So, instead of selling my customer a noisy PC, I decided to try and fix the coil whine. Here you can see what I did. I attempted the hot glue mod, which involves putting hot glue over the coils in a power supply to stop the windings from vibrating. I decided to give this a shot just to see if I could fix this power supply. I applied the hot glue quite extensively to pretty much all of the coils in the power supply and tried giving the PSU another shot. The glue mod did absolutely nothing. In fact, it did so little that the audio sample of the coil whine from the power supply that I played for you a while back was after the hot glue mod because it sounded identical to the original noise. At this point, I was ready to give in and just reinstall the power supply and sell the system as it was. But as time went on and I thought about it more and more, I grew increasingly uncomfortable with the thought of having this hot glue inside the power supply. Even though the safety data sheet for the hot glue that I used states that it's non-flammable and the flash point, not to be confused with the self-ignition point, that one is higher than the flash point, was said to be greater than 232 degrees Celsius, I didn't like the idea of having that hot glue in there. Another thing that made me less comfortable with it being in there was the fact that after testing for the coil whine a bit, the glue on one of the coils was very much starting to melt and drip, which was the final straw for me. I want to be 100% certain of the safety of the computers I sell, not 99% sure it'll be fine. Because of that, I decided to write the power supply off as a loss and put a new one in. However, I've mentioned before that I don't have a spare power supply. Was I going to have to buy a new one to put into this old system? Well, thankfully for me, I was somewhat lying when I said that I didn't have a spare power supply. The truth is, I have this spare CX450M from Corsair that works brilliantly. I just misplaced the SATA power cable for it a long time ago, so it's not that useful for a computer that needs to be able to boot to any kind of drive. I then placed an order for a replacement one of those cables, something I probably should have done a long time ago as I've had this thing for close to 2 years now. Perfect! Now I can just install this power supply into the HP machine and be done with this whole fiasco that was worsened by me, right? Well, not quite. You see, this power supply is decently nice and the computer is, quite frankly, not deserving of it in its current state. Therefore, I decided to perform a bit of a hardware shuffle with another computer that I had on hand. This is an old Dell Optiplex 7010, back from the good old days when Dell still used standard ATX power supplies. This system is my main testbed system, as everything in it is known to be perfectly functional and it's a nice standard ATX sized computer. After struggling for a bit with its left side panel, which has always been a bit stubborn, I was ready to perform my plan. The plan being to remove the Dell OEM power supply, put in the Corsair, and then swap the Dell power supply into the old HP computer. Seamless hardware swap. I should mention, however, that I did make sure the wattages of the power supplies I was swapping would all play nicely, so that I wouldn't end up putting a lower power supply in a system that can draw more power than it can output. That's an important little detail. I started by unplugging the Dell power supply from all the power connectors it was plugged into, and then I removed it by unscrewing the 4 standard ATX power supply screws. Then I installed and screwed in the new power supply, and prepared to plug it all in. The motherboard connector was easy, that just plugged right in. However, the CPU power connector is a bit more complicated. Since this power supply is more tailored to modern hardware that seems to always use an 8-pin EPS connector instead of a 4-pin EPS connector, the CPU power connector is an 8-pin. Thankfully, this 8-pin connector is made by combining two 4-pin EPS connectors. All we need to do is take our pliers so that we can depress these two tabs, and boom, now we have two 4-pin power connectors instead of one 8-pin. Now that the Dell had its old power supply extracted and a new one put in, it's time to put the Dell PSU into the HP computer. So, I'll drop the power supply in, get it all clicked into place, and plug it in. This is when I noticed a pretty big oversight in my plan. You see, the Dell power supply is made specifically for the Dell system, which makes sense. In the Dell system, the CPU power connector is really close to the power supply, so the cable is super short. Now that I was trying to plug the power supply into a system where the CPU power connector is a bit farther away, it wouldn't be able to reach. Now, one could go out and spend a bit of money and buy a cheap cable extension for the power supply, but that takes time and costs money. In my case here, I have soldering gear, and I'm pretty sure you can see what my solution will be. I took the power supply out, cleared off my work area, and got ready to splice some wire extensions into this power supply. The first step in this was to chop off the CPU power connector so that we would be able to put some extensions in the middle of its wires. I then stripped and twisted the wire ends on both the connector that I chopped off and the bits of wire that were still hanging out of the power supply. Twisting these wires turned out to be a waste of time because I had forgotten the method that I used to twist the wires together for thicker gauges of wire requires the strands to be not twisted and instead to be as spread out as possible, as you'll soon see. Next, I grabbed some matching lengths of wire that I chopped off an old donor power supply. If you don't have a donor power supply or cables, make sure to get the right gauge of wire for your power supply's cables. I believe that these were 16 AWG wires, but I'm not 100% certain. Whatever gauge they were the same size. I then proceeded to make the first solder joint absolutely horrendously, as I hadn't remembered the right wire twisting method yet. Thankfully, this is the only one of these joints that looks like this. It sure is ugly, but at least it won't cause any actual issues as there's enough surface area of the wires soldered to each other. The next 3 solder joints were immensely better than that first one, and after they were complete, I made sure to put a piece of heat shrink tubing on all of them. Unlike last time I spliced wires in a video, I found the lighter. Sadly, it wouldn't spark a flame for whatever reason, even though there was more than enough butane in it. Oh well. So instead I used my heat gun, which was minorly overkill to get the job done. It also did a bit of damage to my work surface, even though you used an old PCB to shield it. Oh well. I then put another piece of heat shrink tubing on each wire and slid it as far away from the end of the wire as possible, as we'd be soldering there and don't want it to shrink prematurely. After doing that, it was another 4 of the same solder joints connecting the yellow wires from the power supply to the yellow wires on the connector, and the black wires to the black wires. After that was done, I brought the heat gun out again and shrunk the new tubing over the new solder joints, this time with a few more heat shielding PCBs. With the new power supply having its newly lengthened EPS connector, I could put it back into the computer, screw it back in, and finally plug in all the cables with ease. With all of that done, I could put the side panel back on, plug it in, boot it up, and test it just to make sure it's functioning as it should. And lastly, listen to the beautiful silence that the new power supply offers. Well, that's all for now. I figured that I would make this video just to give you all an update on this system, and to tell you about the mistake that I made with the hot glue mod that only made me less comfortable with the whiny power supply. Needless to say, I won't be doing that again, and that old power supply can get the bad label of death, even though it technically functions. I hope that you were able to enjoy this video. I've got some bigger stuff coming soon, so if this feels like a filler content a bit, it kinda is. I've got a couple computers to work on, and I'm hoping to have those videos out soon, even though school will be starting soon. I hope to see you all next time. Goodbye.